Imagine you are standing on a highland plain in northern Ethiopia. The air is thin and sharp. The sun is already hot even though it is still morning. In front of you rises a stone tower that looks like it was built by people who refused to accept the limits of what stone and human hands could do. It is not a pyramid. It is not a column from Rome or Greece. It is a single block of granite, carved from top to bottom to look like a multi-story palace, rows of false windows, false doors, carved beams and decorative details climbing toward the sky. It stands more than 70 feet tall. A few dozen paces away lies its broken brother. An even larger stone, once meant to be over 100 feet high and weighing more than 500 tons, now lies shattered in pieces on the ground, as if some giant hand snapped it during the moment of its greatest ambition. How did anyone move these things? How did they carve them with such precision? And what kind of kingdom could afford to spend years of labor and thousands of workers on monuments that served no obvious practical purpose except to say, "We are here. We are powerful. Remember us." This is not a story that begins with a date or a king's name. It begins with these impossible stones and a question that has lingered for centuries. What kind of African empire could reach across oceans, trade with Rome, India, and the distant networks that touched China, mint its own gold coins, and then fade in a way that still feels mysterious today? That empire was Aksum, and its story is one of breathtaking ambition, astonishing engineering, global connections most people never learned about in school, and a slow, quiet unraveling that left behind more questions than answers. Let us begin where the wealth began, not in the highlands, but at the edge of the sea. A few days' journey east from the capital of Aksum lay the port of Adulis, on the coast of what is now Eritrea. In the 1st century, a Greek merchant or ship's captain wrote a practical handbook called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. He described Adulis as an open harbor where Roman traders could do business. He mentioned ivory and tortoise shell leaving Africa. At that time, Aksum was still growing into its power, but the geography was perfect. The Ethiopian highlands sat like a natural fortress above the lowlands. They received enough rain in good years to grow wheat, barley, teff, and other crops that could feed a large population and support armies. Just beyond the escarpment, the land dropped toward the Red Sea, that narrow, vital corridor linking the Mediterranean world to the Indian Ocean and everything that lay beyond it. Control the Red Sea trade, and you controlled one of the great arteries of the ancient world. Caravans brought goods from deep in the African interior to collection points like Kalo, then onward to Adulis. From there, ships waited for the right winds. The monsoon system and the seasonal patterns of the Red Sea allowed vessels to sail south in one season and return north in another. African ivory, especially the large tusks of forest and savanna elephants, was in huge demand in the Roman world for furniture, carvings, and luxury goods. Rhinoceros horn, tortoise shell, hippopotamus hide, gold, perhaps emeralds or other precious materials, and even slaves and exotic animals moved through Adulis. In return came wine and olive oil in amphorae from the Mediterranean, fine textiles, glass, metalwork, and luxury items that the Aksumite elite desired. This was not small-scale local trade. This was international commerce on a serious scale, and the people who controlled the highlands and the port understood its value. By the 3rd century, Aksum had grown strong enough that a Persian thinker named Mani listed it as one of the 4 great powers of the known world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. That was not flattery. It was recognition that Aksum sat at a strategic crossroads and had the organization and military reach to matter. Early kings expanded influence into southern Arabia, sometimes through alliance, sometimes through force, partly to secure incense routes and partly to keep rivals in check. They developed their own writing system, Ge'ez, which is still used today in Ethiopian liturgy. They built palaces using a distinctive architecture with wooden monkey head beams and inclined walls. And then, around the year 270, they did something that announced they were no longer just a regional power. They started minting coins. King Endibis, sometimes written in Dubis, began issuing gold, silver, and bronze coins. The gold pieces were roughly the size and weight of a Roman haphorius or tramissus, about 2.5 to 2.8 grams at first. They showed the king in profile wearing a distinctive headcloth or crown, often flanked by ears of wheat or barley. Early inscriptions were in Greek, King of Aksum. Later issues mixed or shifted to Ge'ez. Why coins? Because trade had become too sophisticated and too international for anything else. Roman and Indian merchants were used to standardized currency. If Aksum wanted to trade on equal terms, it needed money that foreigners would trust and accept. By producing their own and keeping the gold pure enough to hold value, they inserted themselves directly into the monetary systems of the wider world. These were not just economic tools, they were political statements. Every gold coin that left Aksum carried the king's face and title into markets in Arabia, possibly India and beyond. Archaeologists have found Aksumite coins in hoards far from Ethiopia. Gold coins especially traveled. They were lightweight, high value, and recognized. Over the decades, the designs evolved. After Christianity arrived, crosses appeared on the coins, some of the earliest Christian symbols on currency anywhere in the world. Mottos changed. Greek gave way more and more to Ge'ez. Weights sometimes shifted. The quality of the lettering on later issues deteriorated, which itself tells a story of changing times. But in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the coins worked. They helped turn Aksum into a true commercial power. The wealth that flowed in from ivory, gold, and other exports could now be measured, stored, and moved more efficiently. The state could pay soldiers, reward allies, and fund ambitious projects. One of those projects was about to change the landscape forever. The stelae of Aksum are among the most extraordinary monuments ever created by human hands. Most were carved and raised between the 1st and 4th centuries, with the greatest concentration in the 3rd and 4th. They stand in fields near the ancient capital. Some are small and roughly shaped. Others are towering monoliths. The largest attempted, the Great Stele, was meant to reach roughly 33 meters, over 108 feet, and weigh around 520 tons. It was carved to resemble a 13-story building, complete with false doors at the base and multiple levels of false windows and architectural details all the way up. Another famous one, the obelisk of Aksum, stands 24 meters tall and weighs about 160 tons. It has 2 false doors at the bottom and window-like carvings on all sides. These were not random pillars. Most scholars believe they marked underground royal tombs. The windows and doors may have represented the multi-story palaces or houses where the elite lived, or perhaps homes for the spirits of the dead in the afterlife. At the base of many stood altars, suggesting offerings or rituals. Carving one was an immense undertaking. The stone came from quarries only a few kilometers away, but moving and raising a 160-ton or 500-ton block required organization on a scale that is hard to imagine today. Workers probably used iron tools to shape the stone while it was still partly attached to the living rock, carving the intricate false architecture with remarkable precision. Transport likely involved rollers, sledges, ropes, levers, and hundreds or thousands of laborers and oxen. Erecting it would have needed carefully engineered ramps, pits, counterweights, or rocking techniques. Methods we can only reconstruct from the evidence left behind and comparison with other ancient engineering projects. For the very largest one, something went catastrophically wrong. It cracked or toppled, perhaps during the final stages of erection. There it still lies today, broken into massive pieces, a permanent reminder that even the most ambitious engineering has limits. The standing stele survived earthquakes, weather, and later conflicts. One of them was taken to Rome as colonial trophy in 1937, cut into 3 pieces, and re-erected there. It was finally returned to Ethiopia in 2005 after years of negotiation, and now stands again near its companions in Axum. These monuments were statements of power, wealth, and belief. They said to anyone who saw them, subjects, traders from distant lands, rival kingdoms, that the rulers of Axum could command resources and labor on a scale few others could match. And then, quite suddenly in historical terms, they stopped being built. The reason lies in one of the most consequential decisions any Aksumite king ever made. In the early 4th century, during the reign of King Ezana, Christianity came to Axum. The traditional story involves a young Christian named Frumentius who arrived at the court, possibly through trade connections or a shipwreck, and became tutor or advisor to the young Prince Ezana. Ezana converted around 325–330 CE and made Christianity the state religion. This was remarkably early. Axum became one of the first kingdoms in the world to adopt Christianity officially. Around the same time, or even slightly before the Roman Empire did so fully under Constantine. Ezana's inscriptions, carved in multiple languages including Greek and Ge'ez, record his victories and his new faith. His coins began to feature the cross instead of older symbols like the disc and crescent. The change was visible and public. With Christianity came a cultural and political reorientation toward the Byzantine and Mediterranean world. Axum was no longer just an African trading kingdom. It was now a Christian power with ties to the great empire to the north. Frumentius became the first bishop, establishing a church structure that would evolve into the distinctive Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. Interestingly, the great stele building program ended around this time. The towering funerary monuments seem to have been tied to older royal and possibly pagan burial practices. With the new faith, those practices changed. The resources and labor that once went into raising giant stones were redirected, or perhaps the religious justification for such monuments no longer existed in the same way. Ezana also campaigned against neighboring groups, including forces associated with Kush, Mara to the northwest. He expanded Aksum's influence and left inscriptions that still survive. His reign represents the peak of Aksumite power and international recognition. By the 6th century, Axum was still formidable. King Caleb launched a major expedition across the Red Sea into Himyar, modern Yemen, around 525 CE, partly at the urging of the Byzantine emperor to protect Christian communities there from persecution by a Jewish king named Dhu Nuwas. Aksumite forces succeeded in installing a Christian viceroy, though the situation later shifted with Persian involvement. Around 520 CE, a Greek merchant from Alexandria named Cosmas Indicopleustes visited Adulis. His book Christian Topography gives us one of the richest contemporary descriptions of Axum at its height. He saw a busy port with markets handling goods from Egypt, the Roman world, and India. He described the Aksumite king's tight control over the gold trade from the interior. Caravans of hundreds of traders traveling with salt, iron, and cattle to exchange for gold from distant mines. He noted Aksumite ships and traders active in the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as Sri Lanka, Ceylon, where goods from even farther east, including silk, cloves, and sandalwood from China, arrived through the wider monsoon networks. Aksum was plugged into a vast commercial web. While direct regular voyages from Adulis all the way to Chinese ports were probably rare or non-existent, Aksumite merchants and ships participated in the Indian Ocean system that ultimately connected Africa to the markets of the East. Contemporaries recognized this reach. Mani had already placed Aksum among the world's great powers. The gold coins continued to circulate, now often bearing Christian crosses and Ge'ez inscriptions. The capital itself was impressive. Cosmas described a royal palace with bronze statues, including unicorns. The city had multiple palaces, elite residences, and the famous Steely Fields nearby. Agriculture on the plateau supported the population. The state controlled key resources and trade routes. This was the Aksum that many outsiders knew: wealthy, Christian, militarily capable, and commercially sophisticated. But the world was shifting beneath their feet. In the late 6th century, the Sasanian Persians gained significant influence in Yemen and the southern Red Sea. Then, in the 7th century, the rise of Islam in Arabia changed the political and religious map of the entire region with astonishing speed. Muslim forces expanded across Arabia, into Egypt, and along the coasts. They took control of key ports and trade arteries that Aksum had long relied upon. The Red Sea was no longer the same open highway it had been. Traditional trading partners in the Byzantine world were under pressure. New powers and new religious networks dominated the routes that had once carried Aksumite ivory, gold, and other goods to distant markets. The volume of trade that had sustained the kingdom's wealth and its ability to fund armies, palaces, and monuments began to decline. Archaeological evidence at Adulis suggests trouble in this period, possible silting of the harbor, reduced activity, or structural decline. Coin minting, which had been a proud symbol of sovereignty since the 3rd century, appears to have stopped sometime in the first half of the 7th century. The last kings known from coins include names like Arma. After that, the numismatic record goes silent. The written record also thins dramatically. Royal inscriptions become rare or non-existent. The urban core of Aksum itself seems to have contracted. Population and power may have dispersed or shifted to other centers. The highlands did not become empty, but the centralized, expansive kingdom that had dominated the Red Sea trade for centuries lost its former strength. Historians point to several factors working together, rather than any single dramatic event. Trade disruption was probably the most immediate blow. When control of the Red Sea and Arabian Peninsula changed hands, Aksum lost its privileged position as the gateway for African exports. Goods still moved, but the profits and the political leverage that came with controlling the routes diminished. Environmental pressures compounded the problem. Centuries of intensive agriculture on the plateau, combined with population growth and the demands of supporting an elite class and large monuments, appear to have led to soil erosion, deforestation, and land degradation. Geoarchaeological studies suggest that by the 7th and 8th centuries, marginal lands were being overexploited, and rainfall patterns may have become less reliable. An economy built on agricultural surplus and trade surplus was vulnerable when both came under strain at once. There were also internal and external political pressures. Possible raids or competition from groups on the periphery, such as the Beja, added stress. As central authority weakened, fragmentation likely increased. The capital may have lost its dominance as power centers shifted. Later Ethiopian tradition preserves a dramatic memory of the end. Around the 10th century, though the exact timing and details are debated, a queen named Giudit, also called Yadit or Asato, is said to have invaded Aksum, burned churches, destroyed monuments, and ended the old royal line. Some scholars see this as a possible folk memory of a real conflict or invasion that delivered a final blow to an already weakened kingdom. Others view it as legendary material that compresses a longer, more gradual decline into a single dramatic story. Either way, it reflects a sense of rupture in collective memory. What makes Aksum's decline feel especially mysterious is how quiet it was compared to the dramatic collapses of other empires. There was no single recorded battle or sack that ended everything. No clear layer of widespread destruction at the capital. Instead, the sources simply grow silent. Coins stop. New grand monuments stop. International trade contracts. The port of Adulis loses its former prominence. Life continued in the highlands, but the expansive, outward-looking kingdom of earlier centuries had transformed into something smaller and more inward-focused. By the 10th or 11th century, new political structures were emerging. The Zagwe dynasty would later rise, and eventually the Solomonic restoration would claim continuity with Aksum through legendary descent from Menelik I, son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Christianity endured and evolved into its distinctive Ethiopian form. The cultural and religious legacy of Aksum never truly disappeared. The obelisks still stand, or lie broken, as the most visible reminders. The gold coins, scattered across ancient trade routes from Arabia to India, survive in museum collections and private hands as tangible proof that an African kingdom once minted money accepted in international commerce. The story of Frumentius and Ezana lives on in Ethiopian Christian tradition. The port of Adulis, though reduced, left archaeological traces that modern excavations continue to uncover. Aksum's rise shows what was possible when geography, organization, and ambition aligned. A kingdom in the African highlands became a peer player in the ancient world's most important trade networks. Its engineers raised some of the largest monolithic structures ever attempted. Its kings adopted a world religion early and made it their own. Its merchants and sailors participated in networks that ultimately reached toward China. Its decline shows how interconnected and fragile those systems could be. When trade routes shifted because of events far away, when ecological limits were reached, when political and religious transformations redrew the map, even a wealthy and sophisticated kingdom could fade without a single catastrophic event. The silent quality of Aksum's later centuries is itself part of the story. A reminder that history does not always announce its turning points with trumpets and battles. The broken giant stele and the standing obelisk standing near each other are perfect symbols. Enormous achievement and ambition on one side, the reality that nothing human-built lasts unchanged on the other. Yet the fact that the standing stone still rises, that Ethiopian Christianity traces roots to Ezana's conversion, and that we can still piece together this story from archaeology, inscriptions, traveler accounts, and coins, means that Aksum was never truly lost. It transformed. In a world where trade networks, environments, and faiths continue to shift, Aksum's story still speaks. It asks us to look at the foundations beneath our own systems of wealth and power. It reminds us that Africa was never on the margins of ancient global history. It was a central player. And it leaves us with the image of those impossible stones, raised by human hands and ingenuity, some still standing after nearly 2,000 years, others broken but never forgotten. What other chapters of African history lie waiting beneath the soil or in the silent centuries? What can we learn from a kingdom that reached across oceans with its ships and its coins, raised stones that still defy easy explanation, embraced a new faith, and then faded in ways we are still working to fully understand? The kingdom of Aksum did not end with a single dramatic fall. It changed. And in that change, its deepest legacies, faith, culture, identity, and the quiet persistence of a people, endured long after the last gold coin was struck and the last great stone was raised toward the sky. Thank you for listening to this journey. If the story of Aksum moved you, share it, discuss it. Keep exploring the chapters of our shared past that too often go untold. The stones are still there, the coins still speak, and the questions they raise are still worth asking. The Kingdom of Urartu, Africa's forgotten stone empire of incense and temples. Close your eyes and imagine this. You are standing on a windswept highland plateau in northern Ethiopia, where the air is sharp and thin, and the red earth stretches toward distant blue mountains. The wind carries the faint, sweet resinous scent of something ancient and sacred, like the ghost of incense that once rose in thick coils toward the sky. In front of you, rising from the ground like a defiant fist against time itself, stands a wall of stone. Not rough field stones tossed together, but precisely cut rectangular blocks, some wider than a man is tall, fitted so perfectly that a knife blade still cannot slide between them after more than 2,500 years. No mortar, no modern cranes, just human hands, vision, and will. This is Yeha, and this silent giant of dressed stone is one of the oldest standing monumental buildings in all of sub-Saharan Africa. But here is the question that haunts anyone who stands before it. How? How did the people who lived here, in this rugged highland far from the famous river valleys of Egypt or Mesopotamia, develop the organization, the surplus wealth, and the technical skill to raise such a structure? What power allowed them to command the labor of hundreds, perhaps thousands, to quarry, transport, and perfectly assemble these massive blocks? And why here, on this plateau, when the easiest routes and richest ports lay closer to the sea? The stones do not answer quickly. They make you wait. They make you wonder. What you are looking at is not a random ruin. It is the visible heart of something much larger, a kingdom that modern scholars call Dumt, or de letter to BFMT, Damat. A realm that flourished in the highlands of what is now northern Ethiopia and central Eritrea between roughly the 8th and 4th centuries BCE. It rose centuries before the famous Aksumite Empire that would later dominate the Red Sea. It left behind stone temples, palaces, elite tombs, early iron working, and inscriptions in a script borrowed from across the narrow waters of the Red Sea. And it did all of this while participating in one of the most lucrative and spiritually charged trades the ancient world ever knew. The movement of frankincense and myrrh, the spices that perfumed temples, anointed kings, and carried prayers to the gods from Egypt to Rome and beyond. This is not a story of isolated villages suddenly deciding to build big. This is the story of how control of aromatic resins, agricultural surplus, strategic highland routes, and cultural connections across the Red Sea created one of Africa's earliest complex kingdoms. A kingdom whose legacy quietly shaped everything that came after it in the Horn, including the empire of Aksum itself. But the story does not begin with kings or dates. It begins with the land, the trees, and the smoke. In the ancient world, certain trees grew only in very specific, difficult places. In the arid canyons of southern Arabia and in the rugged highlands and coastal zones of the Horn of Africa, including areas near what would become Dumt, grew species of Boswellia and Commiphora. When their bark was carefully cut, they wept a precious resin. Frankincense, pale, tear-shaped, burning with a clean, woody, almost citrus brightness that lifted the spirit. Myrrh, darker, more bittersweet, used for healing, embalming, and sacred anointing. These were not ordinary spices for cooking. They were spiritual technology. In temples across the Nile, priests burned them to carry prayers upward. In royal courts, they marked status and divine favor. In burial rites, they preserved bodies and souls. Demand was constant and insatiable. Whoever controlled the trees, the harvesting knowledge, the routes to market, or the ports where the resin changed hands held real power. The earlier Egyptian expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt, very likely centered in or near the Horn, possibly including Eritrean coastal zones, had already shown how valuable these resins were. Pharaohs sent entire fleets and armies of bearers to bring back myrrh trees, incense, ivory, ebony, gold, and exotic animals. By the time Dumt emerged in the highlands, those same networks of desire and exchange had not disappeared. They had evolved. The people living on the Tigray Plateau and surrounding highlands were not passive observers. They farmed barley, emmer wheat, legumes, and possibly early teff in terraced or rain-fed fields. They herded cattle, sheep, and goats. They worked iron as early as the 9th century BCE, one of the earlier evidences in the region. And they sat at a geographic sweet spot, high enough for defensible settlements and good agriculture, yet connected by routes that could reach the Red Sea coast in days of travel. From there, goods could move by ship to Arabia, Egypt, and the wider world. Surplus from good years, combined with access to or production of aromatic resins, or the ability to move them from southern sources, created wealth. Wealth created the ability to support specialists, stonemasons, metal workers, scribes or record keepers, priests, and rulers who could organize labor on a large scale. And that is how a temple like the one at Yeha becomes possible. Picture the scene around 700 BCE. The decision has been made. A ruler, we know some of their names from later inscriptions, such as W2BFRN 1E25, YWT and his successors, or a council of powerful families and religious leaders, has chosen this hilltop for something monumental. Not just another village shrine, but a statement in stone. Quarries nearby yield the right stone. Teams of workers, perhaps organized by kin groups or under central direction, cut massive blocks using stone tools, wooden wedges, and water to split the rock along natural lines. The blocks are levered onto sledges or rollers, then dragged or hauled up the slope by teams of men and oxen. The precision comes from generations of accumulated skill, measuring, testing, adjusting. When the blocks finally meet on the rising walls, they fit with astonishing accuracy. Some walls still stand over 14 meters, 45 plus feet, high today. The structure is dedicated to Almecca, the moon god whose worship was central in the powerful South Arabian kingdom of Saba, Sheba, just across the Red Sea. Other deities from the South Arabian pantheon, letter 2BF ASTAR, Habas, and the goddess letter 2BF ATT Salmon in her local forms, also receive honor. Votive altars are carved and inscribed. Some inscriptions mention the kings of Dumt using titles familiar from Saba. MLK, king, and MKRB, Mukarib, sometimes styling themselves as rulers of Dumt and Saba. This does not necessarily mean Dumt was a colony planted by Saba. The archaeological picture is more nuanced. The majority of everyday pottery and many aspects of daily life appear local and indigenous. South Arabian-style artifacts, inscriptions, and architectural techniques appear strongly in the elite and religious spheres: temples, altars, cert seals, and monumental building. Skilled artisans with Sabaean names are recorded on some votive objects. This suggests a powerful cultural and economic connection. Perhaps through alliance, marriage, trade partnerships, or the presence of a small but influential community of traders, priests, and craftspeople from across the sea, rather than wholesale conquest or replacement of the local population. The temple at Yeha was not alone. There was a second major monumental building nearby, sometimes called the Grat Bel Jubri Palace or Temple Complex, built with similar sophisticated techniques. Elite shaft tombs, deep, carefully constructed burial chambers, held the remains of important people accompanied by imported goods, bronze and iron weapons or tools, and zoomorphic seals. One tomb even contained a fine alabaster vessel of Egyptian or Nubian Meroitic/Kushite type, hinting at wider connections stretching west toward the Nile Valley, as well as east across the Red Sea. Here is where the story deepens into something that still surprises many people today. The same networks that carried incense and myrrh also carried ideas, technologies, and people. The decision to build in the Sabaean architectural style and to honor Almaka was not random. It was strategic. By adopting and adapting elements of the dominant Red Sea trading culture, the rulers of Demt positioned themselves as legitimate players in that world. A temple built in the manner of the powerful kingdoms across the water sent a message. We understand the rules of this game, and we have the resources to play it at a high level. At the same time, local innovations continued. Agricultural systems adapted to the highland environment. Iron working developed. Administrative tools like clay and bronze seals, some zoomorphic, showing animals or simple designs, suggest systems for tracking goods, land, or offerings. The presence of both local and imported items in elite tombs shows a society comfortable with selective adoption rather than wholesale imitation. This balance, strong local roots with sophisticated engagement in long-distance networks, is one of the quiet revelations of Demt. It challenges old assumptions that complex civilization in Africa always had to be imported from elsewhere, or that the Horn was merely a passive supplier of raw materials. Here was a society that could quarry and dress stone on a monumental scale, organize labor, maintain religious institutions, and participate in the most prestigious trade of the era, all while remaining distinctly rooted in the African highlands. But power built on trade and specialized agriculture is rarely stable forever. By the later centuries of Demt's existence, signs of stress appear in the archaeological record. At Yeha, some monumental buildings show evidence of burning. The grand urban or ceremonial center seems to have shrunk or shifted. Population and activity moved or dispersed into smaller, more rural settlements. Meanwhile, in the area around what would become Aksum, slightly to the southwest, new centers were growing. By the 4th century BCE or so, a Proto-Aksumite presence is detectable at sites like Bieta Georges. Did Demt fall in a single dramatic conquest? The evidence does not support a simple story of invasion and collapse. More likely, a combination of factors was at work. Environmental stress on agriculture, shifts in trade routes or partners, internal competition among elite groups, or the gradual rise of new power centers better positioned for changing economic realities. The kingdom did not vanish overnight. Its people, its agricultural knowledge, its tradition of monumental building, and its experience with Red Sea trade networks remained in the land. The later Aksumite Empire would inherit and transform much of this inheritance, expanding the trade networks dramatically, developing its own monumental architecture and writing tradition. Ge'ez evolving in the same cultural soil, and eventually becoming one of the great powers of the ancient world, minting gold coins and controlling Red Sea commerce on a much larger scale. Dimt was not erased. It was the root from which something larger grew. For centuries after its decline, the stones at Yeha and other Dimt sites continued their quiet vigil. Local communities lived around and even inside the ruins. The great temple at Yeha was eventually converted into a church, a powerful symbol of how sacred spaces can be reinterpreted across religious changes while still commanding respect. Then came the modern rediscovery. European travelers and early archaeologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries noted the impressive ruins. Systematic work increased in the later 20th and 21st centuries. Radiocarbon dates, careful study of pottery sequences, analysis of inscriptions, and new surveys around Yeha and other sites have steadily filled in the picture. Projects like the Southern Red Sea Archaeological Histories, SRSAH, have revealed more about surrounding settlements, showing that Yeha was not an isolated temple in an empty landscape, but part of a broader network of activity. Italian Eritrean work at coastal sites like Adulize, more prominent in the later Aksumite period, has illuminated the ports that connected these highlands to the wider world. Yet much remains unknown. Only a fraction of potential sites have been excavated. Political instability and conflict in the Tigray region have interrupted work in recent years. Inscriptions are few and often fragmentary. We have the names of several rulers, W letter 2 BFRN letter 1E25, YWT, and his descendants among them, and glimpses of their piety and building projects. But we lack the detailed royal annals or economic records that exist for better documented ancient states. This is why the stones still feel mysterious. They have given us enough to know that a sophisticated kingdom existed here, deeply connected to the great trade currents of its time, capable of remarkable architectural achievement. But they have not given us everything. And that gap itself is part of the story, a reminder that Africa's ancient past is still being patiently uncovered, one careful excavation and one reread inscription at a time. What does all of this mean for us today? It means that the story of complex societies, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade in Africa does not begin with the pyramids of Egypt or the empires of the medieval Sahel. It has deep roots in the highlands of the Horn, among people who understood the value of aromatic resins that could turn desert trees into spiritual and economic gold, and who had the vision to turn that wealth into stone that would outlast empires. It means that cultural exchange across the Red Sea was not a one-way street of influence from Arabia into Africa. It was a dynamic conversation in which local African communities selected, adapted, and innovated, creating something new that was both connected to wider networks and distinctly their own. It means that the later glory of Aksum did not emerge from nowhere. It stood on the shoulders of Dimt and other pre-Aksumite societies that had already solved the problems of organizing labor, managing agriculture in a challenging environment, and plugging into Red Sea commerce. Most of all, it means that when we stand before the ruins at Yeha today and feel that strange mixture of awe and curiosity, we are touching a chapter of human history that was almost lost to silence. The wind still moves across the plateau. The red earth still holds its secrets, and the perfectly fitted stones still ask the same questions they have asked for 25 centuries. Let's move on to the next topic. Close your eyes and imagine standing on a high, windswept ridge in the ancient Armenian highlands. The air is thin and sharp. Below you lies a vast, steel-blue Lake Van, ringed by snow-capped peaks that pierce the sky like the teeth of some forgotten giant. But it is not the lake or the mountains that hold your gaze. It is what human hands have done to this unforgiving land. You see thin silver lines, canals, slicing down from distant mountain springs with impossible precision, bringing life to slopes that should never have grown more than scrub. You see massive stone fortresses crouching on every strategic cliff and hill, like silent guardians carved from the rock itself. And somewhere in the valleys, you can almost hear the thunder of chariot wheels and the neigh of horses bred for war in these high pastures. This is Urartu, or Biainali, as its people called their own land. In an age when great empires rose along the easy rivers of the lowlands, here in the cold, stony highlands, a different kind of power was born. A power that did not just survive the harsh terrain, it mastered it. And for nearly 2 centuries, this mountain kingdom became the most dangerous rival the mighty Assyrian Empire ever faced. How was it possible? How did a people of the highlands build an iron empire that forced Assyrian kings to march their armies into terrain they hated? How did they turn barren rock into fertile fields with irrigation works that still amaze modern engineers? How did they field chariots and horses that even their enemies grudgingly admired, and raise stone castles so formidable that some still stand today? The answers lie in one of the most remarkable and least remembered stories of the ancient world. A story of ambition carved in stone, water coaxed from mountains, and iron forged in fire. It is a story that begins not with a date, but with a single, audacious refusal. The refusal to let geography decide who would rule. The land that should have broken them. Picture the Armenian highlands as they were 3,000 years ago. Not the gentle river valleys of Mesopotamia or Egypt, where water flowed almost by itself and empires could grow fat on natural abundance. Here, the land was high, cold, and fragmented. Winters were brutal. Summers could be dry. Rain was unreliable. The soil in many places was thin and stony. For centuries, the region was home to many tribes and small kingdoms, known collectively to outsiders as Nari. They fought among themselves. They paid tribute when stronger powers came. They lived in the shadow of the great lowland empires, especially Assyria, whose armies and scribes had been marching northward for generations. Then something changed. In the early 9th century BCE, amid growing pressure from Assyrian campaigns, these scattered highland peoples began to coalesce. A new kingdom emerged, one that would call itself Biainali, and that outsiders would know as Urartu. Its first named ruler in the records was Aramay. But it was under the kings who followed, Sargery I, Ishpuini, and especially Menua, that the real transformation began. They did not have the easy advantages of river floodplains. What they had instead was something more difficult and, ultimately, more powerful. The ability to organize on a massive scale and to reshape the very landscape. The first great project, making the mountains give water. The kings of Urartu understood a truth that many lowland rulers never fully grasped. In the highlands, water was not something that simply arrived with the seasons. It had to be captured, directed, and shared. And the king who could do that on a grand scale would control not just fields, but the loyalty of every village that drank from his canals. Under King Menua, roughly 810–785 BCE, this idea became reality on a breathtaking scale. Imagine the challenge. A spring high in the Artos Mountains or nearby highlands. The water had to travel nearly 45 kilometers, about 28 miles, to reach the plain south of the capital at Tushpa, modern Van, flowing along precise gradients so it would not erode its own banks or lose force. The terrain was steep in places, rocky in others. There were no modern surveying tools, no bulldozers, no concrete. Yet the Urartians built it. They lined sections with stone. They created channels that followed the contours of the land with astonishing accuracy. When the canal was complete, water flowed from the mountains and turned previously marginal land into productive fields, vineyards, and orchards. The area around Tushpa became greener, more abundant. The kingdom's heart grew stronger. This was not a one-off project. Menua and the kings who followed launched a whole program of hydraulic engineering. Canals, reservoirs, and smaller irrigation works spread across the realm. Later kings continued and expanded the system. The result was agricultural surplus in a land that had never been naturally generous. Why did this matter so much? Because surplus meant more people could be fed. More people meant larger armies and more labor for building projects. More labor meant more fortresses and more canals. It was a virtuous cycle, powered not by a great river, but by human will and engineering genius applied to the mountains themselves. And here is the deeper point that the inscriptions and the ruins quietly reveal. These were not just practical works. They were statements of power. Every canal that brought water to new fields carried the king's name carved in stone. The water itself became a symbol of royal benevolence and control. In the highlands, where life depended on mastering water, the king who controlled the flow controlled the future. But water alone does not win wars or hold empires. For that, Urartu needed something else: the iron edge and the thunder of chariots. While the canals were being dug, another revolution was underway across the ancient world: the slow, uneven transition from bronze to iron. Bronze was beautiful and strong, but it required tin and copper, often traded over long distances and controlled by elites. Iron, once the techniques for smelting and working it spread, was more abundant. It could make tougher tools and, crucially, more weapons. Urartu sat in a region with mineral resources. Archaeological finds include iron plowshares, pitchforks, and weapons. The kingdom became known for sophisticated metalwork in both bronze and iron. Bronze cauldrons with bullhead decorations, helmets, and armor fittings show high craftsmanship. But it was the growing use of iron for tools to build canals and fortresses faster, and for weapons that could be produced in greater numbers, that gave them a practical edge. And then there were the horses and chariots. The highlands were famous for horse breeding. Assyrian records themselves grudgingly note the quality of Urartian horses and horsemen. In an age when chariots were still a decisive shock weapon on suitable terrain, light, fast platforms for archers or javelin throwers, this mattered enormously. Urartian kings fielded chariot forces alongside infantry and cavalry. In the valleys and on the plateaus where battles were often decided, the combination of disciplined troops, good horses, and iron-reinforced equipment made Urartu a dangerous opponent, even on the offensive. But the real genius of Urartu's military power was not just what they carried into battle. It was where they chose to fight from. The stone sentinels that watched over everything. If you travel through eastern Turkey and Armenia today, you can still see them. The ruins of Urartian fortresses perched on steep hills, rocky promontories, and mountain spurs. They were not built for comfort. They were built to dominate. The most famous is the capital itself, Tushpa, on its great limestone cliff overlooking Lake Van. The walls were massive, built of huge, roughly shaped stones fitted together without mortar in the Cyclopean style. There were rock-cut tombs for the kings, including chambers associated with Argishti-I inscriptions and stele proclaimed royal deeds. Storage rooms, palaces, temples, and administrative buildings filled the citadel. But Tashba was only the greatest of many. King Argishti-I, roughly 785–753 BCE, founded Irrabuni in 782 BCE on a hill near what is now Yerevan. He settled 6,600 prisoners from conquered lands there, a common Urartian practice that simultaneously removed potential rebels from their homes and provided labor for new royal centers. The fortress at Irrabuni had thick walls, buttressed towers, and a palace complex. It was both a military stronghold and a statement that Urartu now controlled the northern reaches of its world. Other fortresses, Argishtihinili, Taishibani, Karmir Blur, Iones, Altantep, and dozens more, formed a network across the highlands. They controlled mountain passes, guarded agricultural plains fed by the new canals, stored grain and weapons, and housed garrisons that could respond quickly to threats. Why so many fortresses? Because Urartu's strength was also its vulnerability. The same mountains that made invasion difficult for enemies also made it hard for the Urartian kings to control their own territory quickly. A network of strongholds allowed centralized power to project outward. It turned the highlands into a fortress-studded landscape where any invading army would face one strongpoint after another, while Urartian forces could move between them using interior lines. The fortresses were also economic and administrative centers. They collected taxes in grain, horses, and cattle. They housed the specialists who maintained the canals. They were the physical embodiment of a state that had learned to organize labor and resources on a scale previously unknown in the highlands. And they worked. For generations, Assyrian armies that marched north found themselves facing not just warriors, but an entire system of fortified control that was extremely difficult to uproot. The great rivalry, when mountain met empire. By the mid-8th century BCE, Urartu had become more than a regional power. Under kings like Argishti-I and Sargeri-II, it expanded aggressively into the Aras River Valley, toward Lake Urmia, and even into areas of northern Syria and eastern Anatolia that Assyria considered its sphere of influence. Assyrian records begin to speak of Urartu with a new tone. Not just another troublesome highland tribe, but a genuine rival empire. The clashes were frequent and brutal. In 743 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria defeated Sargeri-II in the region of Arpad/Commagene and pursued the Urartian forces. Assyrian armies even reached the approaches to Tashba itself in later campaigns. But Urartu was not broken. The most dramatic confrontation came in 714 BCE, under Sargon II of Assyria and Rusa I of Urartu. Sargon launched a major campaign deep into Urartian territory. Assyrian forces won victories, including around Lake Urmia. Then, they struck at one of the holiest and most symbolically important places in the Urartian world, the city of Musasir, Ardini, home to a major temple of the god Haldi, the supreme deity of the Urartian pantheon. The Assyrian sack of Musasir was devastating. The temple was plundered. The great statue of Haldi was carried away. For a people whose kings presented themselves as the earthly agents of Haldi, this was not just a military defeat. It was a profound religious and psychological blow. Rusa I did not survive the humiliation. Ancient sources suggest he took his own life or died in disgrace shortly afterward. It looked, to many observers at the time, as though Urartu's days as a great power were over. But the story was not finished. The phoenix rises, and then the shadows lengthen. Rusa I's son, Arjashti II, launched counteroffensives. Urartian forces reclaimed territory. Later kings, especially Rusa II, continued major building programs, more fortresses, more irrigation works, including the foundation of Teishabeni, Karmir Blur. The kingdom showed remarkable resilience. There were periods of uneasy peace or even diplomatic contact with Assyria. But the underlying rivalry never fully disappeared. Then the wider world changed. The Assyrian Empire itself, after centuries of dominance, began to crumble under internal pressures and attacks from Babylonians, Medes, and others. In 612 BCE, Nineveh fell. Urartu, already weakened by generations of warfare and the constant drain of resources, now faced new threats from the north and east. Nomadic groups like the Cimmerians and Scythians, who raided through the highlands, and the rising power of the Medes. The final chapter is still partly mysterious. Archaeological evidence at several sites shows destruction layers with fire and abandonment. Some cities were sacked. Others seem to have been evacuated or slowly declined. By around 590 BCE, the independent Kingdom of Urartu had ceased to exist as a political entity. The Medes appear to have played a major role in its final conquest, though the exact sequence remains debated among historians because contemporary records are sparse. What is clear is that the end was not a single dramatic battle like the fall of some other ancient capitals. It was the result of cumulative exhaustion. Decades of war with Assyria, raids by nomads, and the difficulty of holding together a highland empire when the old balance of power collapsed. The legacy carved in stone and flowing water. And yet Urartu did not simply vanish. Its fortresses, some of them, continued to be used or adapted by later peoples. Its irrigation techniques influenced agricultural practice in the region for centuries. Its artistic and metallurgical traditions left traces. Most importantly, the memory of this highland power lived on in the land that would become Armenia. Later Armenian historians, writing centuries afterward, preserved distorted but recognizable echoes of Urartian kings and their struggles against Assyria. Modern archaeology has restored the real story. A sophisticated Iron Age state that achieved extraordinary things in a difficult environment. The ruins of Irribuni still overlook Yerevan. Parts of Menua's canal system still carry water in the Van region. The massive stone walls of Tushpa still stand above Lake Van, silent witnesses to an ambition that refused to accept the limits of mountain geography. What does this story really mean? It is easy to look at Urartu and see only another ancient kingdom that rose and fell. But there is something deeper here. In a world where most great powers grew along rivers and in fertile plains, Urartu proved that human organization, engineering vision, and the disciplined use of available technology could turn even harsh highlands into the center of an empire. The canals were not just ditches. They were declarations that nature could be negotiated with on human terms. The fortresses were not just defensive works. They were arguments in stone that this land belonged to those who could master it. The chariots and iron weapons were not just tools of war. They were the cutting edge of a society that had learned to produce and organize at scale. The Urartians remind us that geography is never destiny. What matters is what people do with the hand they are dealt. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. Today, when we face our own mountains, whether literal challenges of environment and resources, or metaphorical ones of building systems that last, we can look to these ancient Highlanders who refused to be limited by stone and cold and distance. They asked the mountains for water, and the mountains answered. They asked the rock for walls, and the rock obeyed. They asked iron and horses and human labor to serve a vision greater than any single lifetime. The empire they built eventually fell, as all empires do. But the questions they answered with their lives and their works still echo. What can determined people achieve when they refuse to accept that their environment has the final say? And what traces will we leave in the stone and the water of our own age? Traces that might still speak, thousands of years from now, of what we dared to build. That is the story of Urartu, not just an empire of iron and stone, but a testament to the oldest and most human of all rebellions, the refusal to let the world remain as it was given to us. Let's move on to the next topic. The white gold that built a world. Salt is not glamorous today. We shake it over our food without thinking. But 3,000 years ago, salt was power. It was life itself. Before refrigeration, before canning, before any of the ways we preserve food now, salt was the only reliable way to keep meat, fish, and dairy from rotting. Armies could march farther. Traders could travel longer routes. Settlements could grow larger because people could store food through the winter. Salt was the oil, the gold, and the strategic resource all rolled into one. Control the salt, and you controlled wealth on a scale most people in Bronze Age Europe had never seen. The mountain above Hallstatt had been producing this white gold for a very long time. People had been chipping away at it since at least the Neolithic period, around 5000 BCE. A deer-antler pickaxe left behind by one of those earliest miners was found in 1838, still lying where he dropped it thousands of years earlier. But something changed around 1500 BCE, in the middle of the Bronze Age. People stopped treating the salt as a seasonal gift they collected when convenient. They began organized, systematic mining. They built wooden staircases into the mountain. One of them, dated by tree rings to the year 1344 BCE, is still there today, the oldest preserved wooden staircase in Europe. They dug deeper, followed the salt veins, and created tunnels that eventually reached 200 meters into the rock. And the mountain repaid them. Because of the salt, the people who controlled Hallstatt became rich. Not just comfortable, genuinely wealthy by the standards of their time. That wealth shows up in the most dramatic way possible, in how they buried their dead. The cemetery that named an age. In 1846, a salt mine manager named Johann Georg Ramswer began digging into a hillside above the lake at Hallstatt. What he found would change archaeology forever. He did not find one grave. He found over 1,000. Ramswer was meticulous for his time. He recorded every grave, every object, every layer. Over the years, he and later archaeologists would uncover more than 1,300 burials containing the remains of around 2,000 people. The cemetery was in use from roughly 1200 BCE all the way down to about 500 BCE. This was not a normal burial ground. The graves told a story of a society that was changing fast. In the earlier period, most people were cremated, their ashes placed in urns, following the customs of the Urnfield culture that came before them. But as time passed, something shifted. More and more people were buried as whole bodies, laid out with their possessions around them. And the possessions were not equal. Some graves were simple, a few pots, perhaps a knife. Others contained iron swords, bronze vessels, jewelry made of gold and Baltic amber, and even complete four-wheeled wagons or carts. The difference was not random. It reflected a new reality. Some families had gained control of the salt, the iron, and the trade routes that connected them to the wider world. Those families were burying their dead like royalty. The Hallstatt cemetery does not contain one single king's grave. Instead, it shows a whole community where wealth was distributed across many burials, but still clearly concentrated in certain families. These were not the miners themselves lying in the richest tombs. The people swinging the picks were almost certainly not the ones being buried with gold torques and imported bronze cauldrons. The rich graves belonged to the people who organized the mining, protected the resource, and managed the trade. Salt had created a new kind of power. In 1977, archaeologists near Hochdorf in southern Germany opened a burial mound that had been built around 530 BCE. Inside was something extraordinary. One of the most complete and richest early Celtic burials ever found. It has been called the Tutankhamun of the Celts. The man inside was about 40 to 50 years old, roughly 1.8 meters tall for his time. He had been laid out on a massive bronze couch, or recliner, with wheels. The couch itself was a masterpiece, decorated with geometric patterns and figures, supported on 8 wheels so it could be moved. Nothing quite like it has been found anywhere else from this period. Around him were objects that revealed exactly what kind of man he had been in life. He wore a gold-plated torque around his neck, a symbol of high status. On his feet were thin gold plaques shaped to cover his shoes, even though the shoes themselves had long since decayed. He had a gold-hilted dagger, a birch-bark hat, amber jewelry, and personal grooming tools, a razor, nail clippers, and a comb. At his feet stood an enormous bronze cauldron, over a meter wide, decorated with 3 lions around the rim. It was not made locally. It had been imported from the Greek world, probably through trade networks that reached all the way to southern Italy or beyond. Inside the cauldron were traces of mead, enough to fill it with about 400 liters. 9 drinking horns hung on the walls of the burial chamber. 9 sets of bronze dishes sat on a 4-wheeled wagon that had been placed inside the tomb with him. Everything was arranged for a feast for 9 people. This was not random. This was a statement. The man in the Hochdorf grave had lived at the height of Hallstatt power. He controlled resources, hosted important gatherings, and maintained connections that brought luxury goods from the Mediterranean into the heart of Central Europe. When he died, his community did not just bury him. They recreated the world he had ruled, the feasting, the status symbols, the wagon ready for a journey, and sent it all with him into the ground. This single grave tells us more about Hallstatt society than 1,000 ordinary burials ever could. It shows us a world where power was personal, visible, and tied directly to the ability to control trade and host rituals that bound people together. The mountain that preserved time. While the elites were being buried with gold and Greek bronze, ordinary life continued in the tunnels above Hallstatt. The salt did something remarkable. It preserved organic materials that almost never survive from this period. Archaeologists have found wooden carrying frames and backpacks that miners used to haul salt out of the tunnels. They have found leather caps, fragments of clothing, even remnants of food. The same salt that killed the man discovered in 1734 also saved these everyday objects from decay. We can see how the miners worked. They used bronze picks to break the salt face. They built wooden staircases and ladders to reach deeper levels. They worked in teams, hauling baskets and sacks upward through narrow passages. It was dangerous work, rockfalls, bad air, and the constant risk of collapse. The man found in 1734 may have been killed by exactly that kind of accident around 1000 BCE. These were not slaves or prisoners. The evidence suggests organized, skilled labor. The people who controlled the mine had to feed, equip, and manage these workers. The wealth from the salt paid for all of it. And that wealth did not stay in Hallstatt. It traveled. The web that connected a continent. By the 6th century BCE, Hallstatt influence stretched across a huge area of Central and Western Europe, from eastern France through southern Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Bohemia, and into parts of the Balkans and northern Italy. This was not an empire with kings and armies marching under one banner. It was a network of communities that shared material culture, technology, and probably language, all connected by trade routes that followed rivers and mountain passes. Salt moved outward. Iron moved outward. In return came amber from the Baltic, gold, and increasingly luxury goods from the Mediterranean world, Greek pottery, Etruscan bronze vessels, and eventually that massive Greek crater found in the Vix burial in Burgundy, France. The Vix princess grave, dating to the late 6th or early 5th century BCE, contained the largest known ancient bronze vessel from the classical world. A crater over 1.6 meters tall, made in Greece and transported across the Alps or along the Rhone. It was buried with a woman of high status, along with other imported goods. Similar princely or chieftain burials appear at multiple sites across the Hallstatt world. These graves are not evidence of conquest. They are evidence of connection. The people of the Hallstatt culture were not isolated in their alpine valleys. They were participants in a much larger ancient world, one that reached from the Atlantic to the Aegean. The turn of the age. Around 500–450 BCE, something changed. Many of the old Hallstatt centers began to lose their dominance. Some settlements were abandoned or declined. New centers of power emerged, often further west or in different locations. The distinctive art style that had been geometric and relatively restrained began to transform into something more fluid, more dynamic, swirling curves, animal motifs, and a completely new visual language. This is the beginning of what archaeologists call the Latin culture. It did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of the same communities, the same networks, the same people. But something had shifted. Perhaps the salt resources at Hallstatt itself were becoming harder to reach or less profitable. Perhaps new trade routes opened up with the founding of Greek colonies like Massalia, modern Marseille, on the Mediterranean coast, pulling wealth and attention westward. Perhaps internal competition or social changes created new leaders who expressed their power in new ways. Whatever the exact combination of reasons, the old Hallstatt world did not simply disappear. It evolved. The material culture changed, the centers of power moved, and the artistic expression became more elaborate. By the time Roman writers began describing the Celts centuries later, the Latin world was in full flower, but its roots reached straight back into the salt mines and rich graves of Hallstatt. What the salt still holds. The story of the Hallstatt culture is not the story of a mysterious people arriving from somewhere else and taking over Europe. It is the story of local communities who discovered how to turn a geological accident, a mountain full of salt, into wealth, power, and cultural influence. They adopted iron technology, built trade networks that reached across the continent, developed new forms of social hierarchy, and created burial rituals that displayed their status in spectacular ways. They were not proto-Celts, in the sense of being a primitive version of something that came later. They were the early stages of a cultural tradition that would eventually be called Celtic. A tradition rooted in Central Europe, shaped by resources and innovation, and connected to the wider ancient world long before Rome ever marched north. The man found in the salt in 1734 never knew any of this. He was just doing his job deep in the mountain when something went wrong. But the salt that took his life also saved his story. And the culture that grew up around that same mountain gave Europe one of its most enduring and influential traditions. We still do not know everything. New excavations continue. The salt still hides objects and perhaps even more bodies in tunnels that have not yet been explored. Every new find adds another piece to the puzzle. But one thing is already clear. The Celts did not simply appear. They grew out of places like Hallstatt, out of salt, iron, trade, ambition, and the human need to turn the gifts of the earth into something greater than survival. The next time you sprinkle salt on your food, remember the mountain in Austria, where that simple mineral once built kingdoms, preserved the dead, and helped shape the identity of an entire civilization. The story is still being written, and the salt is still waiting,